Hi everyone, welcome back to Lyfey Technologies YouTube channel and thank you for watching. And please, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, kindly click that subscribe button and stay tuned for more upcoming videos. So this is part 4 of our Nokia Lab Simulation series, and in this episode we'll be discussing how to implement Epipe or VPWS, the virtual private wire service, or Nokia routing and switching devices. So VPWS, it's a layer 2 VPN. It's a point-to-point connection, and on Nokia we normally call them the E-pipes. Of course, we have different variants of VPWS. So in this episode, we'll be focusing on how to implement the E-pipes on Nokia routing and switching devices. So normally we use them to deploy enterprise services on a service provider network and establish connection for remote customers. So for remote customers, it's like they are directly connected to each other. So this is the topology that we are using. You can see that we have C01 and C02. These are simulating the customer devices. And then we have our MPLS backbone network. So in our MPLS backbone network, we have two provider edge routers, PE01 and PE02. And we also have the provider router, P01. And in this MPLS backbone, we'll be configuring ISIS as our IGP because we require to have connectivity between different nodes. So we'll use ISIS as our IGP. If you haven't watched our previous episode, we discussed in detail how to configure and implement ISIS protocol on Nokia routing devices. You can check out the video on our channel. So we'll be configuring an E-pipe from PE01 to PE02 so that we have a connection between CE01 and CE02. So these are the physical connection between the different routers. We have R1, which is CE01, we have R2 PE01, and then we have R3 is P01, and R4 is the PE02, and R5 is CE02. And then we have the physical connection. We have Ethernet 1 between R1 and R2. And the other connection are also as indicated. So Ethernet 1 will be our C1 interface on the router, and then Ethernet 2 will be our C2 interface on the router. So for the implementation steps, we still follow the same steps we have been following. We first need to do port configuration. So we need to do the breakout configuration and do physical port configuration on all the routers. Once we have done the port configuration, we can now configure interfaces between different routers in our MPLS backbone. So we need to configure an interface on P01 to P01, and P01 need to configure two interfaces and also the system interfaces. So once we have configured interfaces and assign IP addresses, the next step is now to configure ISIS on routers in the PLS backbone. Remember, we are using IGP, so we need IGP to be able to have connectivity between remote PEs. And then once we have done ISIS configuration, we verify the status, and we move to the third step, which we need to configure MPLS and LDP on routers in MPLS backbone. So remember, we'll be using label switching, so we need to configure LDP as our signaling protocol. The fourth step will be to configure the service distribution point. Those are like the tunnels. So we need to configure SDPs on P01 and P02. Once we have done the SDPs, the final step will be to configure E-pipes from P01 to P02 and then test our connectivity by configuring interfaces on C01 and C02. So I will log into the routers. These are the configurations for our lab. You can see that step 1, we need to perform port configurations. And once we have done port configuration, so we'll start with port configurations. Let me just first log into the routers. So these are the routers, R1, this is R4, this is R3, this is R2, this is R1. So the first step of our configuration, we need to configure the system. So we can use the command configure system name. Remember, this is R1, so it will be CE01. And then on R2, this is P1. So we'll configure system name PE01, and then we have R3, which is the P router. So configure system name P01, and then on R4 configure system name. This is our PE02, the provider edge router 2. And finally on R5, this is our C2. So configure system name C02. So we have finished configuring the system name on all the routers. So the next step is now to configure ports. So remember, for the port configurations, we need to enable LLDP and configure the mode. So we have different modes, and we also need to configure the encapsulation type. So we'll be using .eq as our encapsulation type, and on C1 we'll be configuring this port as a hybrid mode so that we can configure an interface on it. So we have different modes, so you need to specify the mode that you are using on different ports. Of course, it will depend on the requirement. You can have an access port, you can have a hybrid port, you can have an access port, depending on the requirement. So a network port, of course, is the one that we are configuring an IP address on the physical port. We have a hybrid port. You can have both VLAN tagged, and you can also have a configuration of IP address. Then we have the access port. Access port, you only tag the VLANs. So for this configuration on C1, I will configure C1. So I will copy this, come to C1 and paste. So we have configured port 1, we can show port. So we have port 1, these are the port 1. The admin state is up, the link state is also up. The MTU, you can configure MTU. The port mode is configured as hybrid. We have port encapsulation set to .eq. So we can do configuration on PE02. On PE02, we are configuring 2 ports. The first port, we are configuring it as access. Remember, this is where we'll be configuring the interface facing the CE. So we'll configure it as access. The second port will be default to the network port. So by default, they are all network ports, but you can change the modes. And then for this one, we are also configuring the encapsulation to be .eq so that the services will be VLAN tagged. And then we enable LLDP on the interfaces. So I will copy this for PE01, go back to our R2, which is PE01, and paste. We can show port to verify that the 2 ports are up. You can see the first port, we have encapsulation set to .eq. This is an access port. I've mentioned if we don't configure the mode, then the default mode will be network. So we can go to P01. P01, we also have 2 ports. We have 2 ports that are connecting to PE01 and PE02. All ports will be configured as network ports. So we just need to enable LLDP and give port description. So I will copy this, log in to P01, which is R3, and paste. We can show port to verify. So we have 2 ports are up, they are both network ports. And then on P2, we do the same. We need to configure 2 ports, one facing the CE and another one facing the P01. So the one facing the CE, we have to configure the mode as access and encapsulation type to .eq, and we can configure also the MTU values. So I will copy this, log in to PE02, which is R4, and paste. Do info. So on PE02, we have configured the 2 ports. Finally, we need to configure CE02. So CE02, we are configuring the mode to be hybrid and configuring the encapsulation to be .eq and enabling LLDP. So I will copy this CE02, R5, and configure it. So we can show port, you can see that the mode is hybrid, and we have .eq encapsulation configured. So we can show system LLDP neighbor just to verify that we have LLDP neighboring discover information exchange between the routers. On this one, we can also show system LLDP neighbor, so we have a connection that is up on this port. So once we have done our port configuration, the next step is now to configure the router interfaces. So the same way we have done in our previous episodes, we also need to do the same. We need to configure interface facing the routers in the MPLS backbone, and we also need to configure the system interface. So on P1, we create an interface facing to R3. R3, remember, this one will be our P01. So I'll just leave it the way it is and assign an IP address of 10.10.10.0/31, and also we assign the loopback IP of 2.2.2.2, mask is 32. So I will log in to P1. This is R3, R2, exit. You need to be in the right configuration hierarchy and paste. We can do info. We have our interface configurations on P01. On P01, we need to configure two interfaces, one to R2, that is to P2 to P1, and another one to P2. So these are the configuration. We assign IP address and bind the necessary ports that are connecting the different routers. So I will copy this, log in to R3, which is our, I will exit and paste info. So we have the interface configured, we have the IPs assigned, and ports bind to the interfaces. The next router to configure is P02. So on P02, we need to configure one interface facing to R3, which is P01, and also assign IP address to the system interface. So I will log in to R4 and paste. So we can show router interface. So on R3, we can test connectivity between different routers, show router interface again. We can ping the two interconnected interface, 10.10.10.0. We are able to ping. We can ping 10. This is 10.10.10.3, the peer IP address, and we are able to ping. So this one verify that our configurations are okay. So the next stage is to configure ISIS in the MPLS backbone. I mentioned that we are using ISIS as our IGP, so we need to enable ISIS on the different routers in the MPLS backbone and activate it on the interface. So we are configuring ISIS process 10 on all the routers and activating on the interface. All the interfaces are configured to be in level 2. So I will copy this for P1, exit and paste info so that we see the ISIS configuration. These are the ISIS configuration for P1. We'll move to next router, which is P01. For P01, we also configure ISIS process 10, enable the interfaces. So I will log in to R3, exit, configure, can do info to verify the configuration. So these are ISIS configuration on P01. We have activated ISIS on the two physical interfaces, the logical interfaces configured facing the two routers, P01 and P02, and also on the system interface. The level is configured as level 2. So finally, we need to configure ISIS on our on our PE2. So I will log in to R4 and paste. So we can verify the SIS status starting from R2, or we can just do it on R3 because R3 connect the two routers. So we can show router ISIS 10 adjacency. We have two adjacencies. We can show router ISIS interface, ISIS 10 interface. We have these interfaces in ISIS. We haven't changed the interface type, so by default they will be in the broadcast. Another thing, we can show ISIS 10 adjacency detail to see more detail about our peering sessions. We can show router ISIS 10 route. So we have the routes. We can try to ping from P1 to P2. So we show router ISIS 10 routes, and then we can ping the loopback IP of our P2. So this one should be 2.2.2. So we are able to ping from P1 to P2. So this one verifies that our IGP is well configured and it's working okay. So the next stage is now to configure MPLS and LDP in our MPLS backbone. So we need to configure MPLS, enable it on the interfaces. This is how you enable it on the interface. You just need to specify the interface and run the no shutdown command. For LDP, the same. We are also configuring TCP session using the peer transport address. So this one you can see that we are specifying the peer transport address to be 4.4.4. Let me verify this. So we are configuring this session between P1 and P2. So this is the IP address of P2. And then on P2 we do the same. We are also specifying the peer IP address of our P01. So I will copy this to configure LDP and MPLS. So this is on P01. So I'll log into R2, exit, and paste info. So we have LDP configuration, exit, info. You can see our MPLS and LDP configurations down here. So this is LDP configuration. We have other default configurations. So I'll do the same on P01. So on P01 we have multiple interfaces that we need to enable. Of course, we need to enable on the system interface to P1 and interface to P2. So on R3, which is our P01, I will paste these configurations, configure router, and do info. So once you run that, you will be able to see our MPLS and LDP configurations. And finally, we need to configure P2. So on P2, I've mentioned that we are configuring for the TCP session. We are doing a remote LDP session between the two routers. So I will copy this and configure on our P2. So I'll paste P2, configure router. We can do info to verify the configurations. So these are LDP configuration, and of course we have MPLS configs up here. RSVP is not enabled. If you require RSVP, you can also enable it. Just simple, you need to enter the interface and no shutdown command. So once we have done the MPLS configuration, the next step is now to configure SDPs. So for the SDPs, I've mentioned that these are the service distribution point. They are like we are configuring tunnels between the two PE routers. So you just need to specify the SDP ID and the type is MPLS, and then create and specify the far end IP. So the far end on P1 will be 4.4.4.4, and you need to specify the signaling protocol. So we are using LDP as our signaling protocols. So I will copy these and configure on our P1. So R2 is our P1, exit, paste. You can do info. So we have our SDP configurations. Can show service SDP. You can enter a question mark. You can do detail. So service SDP 1004. So you have your SDP. Operation state is still down. Remember, we also need to configure the far end. So the admin state is up, but the operation state is down. And the signaling protocol is targeted LDP. So that is configured well. So we need to do a similar configuration on PE2. On PE2, we are configuring the far end of 2.2.2.2. That is the IP address of P2, of P1. We can configure the service, the SDP ID can be a separate one. You don't have to merge the far and the local end. So we can copy this, go to P2, show service SDP. We don't have an SDP configured, so exit, paste. So we have configured SDP. We can do info on the services, show service SDP. So we now have an SDP, and you can see now the state is up because we have already configured P1. So when I rerun the same command, you can see that now our SDP is up. So the final stage of this implementation is to now configure our Epipe service. So for the Epipe configuration, we are using VLAN 100 as our Epipe ID, so as our service ID. So we need to configure VLAN 100 on both routers. And then once we have configured the Epipe, we also need to specify the SDP. So this is specified on the Spoke SDP. You can see we are also calling that ID that we have configured. So these are the configuration for Epipe. We'll start by configuring P1. So on P1, I'll do exit, configure, paste. You can do info. So when you do info, you can see that first we have our SDP and then we have our Epipe configured down here. We can do configuration. Remember, this one always has to be, you have the ID configured here. If it's 100, it has to be 100. And then the VLAN ID, the SAP, we are also configuring the SAP. So this is the access port that we are configuring, and we are tagging it with VLAN 100 facing the customer. So that is like the VC ID, the virtual circuit ID. So we'll go into P2, exit. So when we can run the command show service Epipe, show service using. You can see that we have an Epipe 100 and the operation state is down because we need to configure the far end. So on R4, I don't need to exit R4, paste. So rerun the same command on R4. You can see that our SDP is up, our Epipe is now up. So to verify the service details, you can show service ID. The service ID is 100. You need to add the base command. So you can see that our service type is an Epipe. We have the name is 100. Can give it a description. You can always give it a description when you are configuring these services. MTU is set to 1514. You can configure MTU. Operation state is up. The SDP bind count, we have only bind one SDP, and many other details that you can observe from this command. Then we have the identifier, the type, service access and destination point. So this is the SAP that we have configured with VLAN 100, and then this is the SDP that we have bind. So these two are bind together, and the operation state and admin state, they are all up. So on R4 we also expect the same. Show service ID 100 base. You can see the detail, the operation state is up, the MTU, and many other details that you require. So once we have done this, we can do a ping for this Epipe. So we have a command O&M VCC ping. VCC ping, we should be able to ping, and then we need to specify the SDP ID and the VC ID. So we can give it 100, and maybe we do a count of 10 just to be able to verify that we can be able to ping. On R2 we can do the same, exit. So we can run the command O&M VCC ping to do a ping for this service, and then we specify 1,100. We do a count of 5. We are able to ping. So our Epipe is now up from P1 to P2. So the final stage of configuration is now to configure interfaces on C1 and C2. And once we have configured the interfaces, we should be able to ping from router 1 to router 2. So on C1, can do exit, configure router interface. This one will be to C02. We can specify SAP. Let's see info detail. So we can assign address of, we go back to the topology, we have an IP address of 110.20.20.0. So we need 10.20.20.0, mask is that one. We need to specify port. This one we are using 1. Which port? Let's show port again. So we are using port. This is the port. Can copy. Let's copy it, paste, and we need to specify VLAN 100 info. So we have this configuration. We can go to R2 and do the same. Exit, configure router interface. So this one will be to C01, address 10.10.10.20.20.1, mask is 31, specify port, it's same port, and VLAN is 100. Show info. So let's try to ping. If I do a ping 10.20.20.0, we are able to ping from C1 to C2. So this one verifies that our Epipe is okay and it's working okay on the service provider network. So we can also do a ping from this end, ping 10.20.20.1, the far end. So we are able to ping from C1 to C2. So this one verifies that our Epipe configuration setup are okay, and we are able to communicate via the or through the service provider network. So this is how you implement an Epipe on Nokia devices. I hope you have enjoyed our session. Just a recap for the steps. You need to configure the ports, you need to configure the router interfaces, you need to configure ISIS or SPF at the IGP, whichever you choose. You also need to configure MPLS and LDP on routers. And once you have done that, you can now configure the SDP, the Epipe, and then test your connectivity via the service provider network. So thank you again for watching, and please remember to leave your comment if you have any question to ask, or if you have anything that you need to clarify. Feel free to comment on this video, and also if you have enjoyed the session, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos. Thank you.